Nestled in the heart of Ashton Hollow, a quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and golden wheat fields, life moved at a slow, steady pace. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, and the biggest event of the week was the local farmers' market. The streets were lined with quaint houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns, and the scent of fresh-baked bread often drifted from the town's only bakery. At the edge of town, in a modest, weathered house, Peter and Brian lived together, caught in a quiet struggle against time. Peter, once a strong and capable former military dog trainer, was now in the grips of Alzheimer's disease, slowly losing pieces of himself each day. Brian, his son, had once thrived in the fast-paced world of Chicago's tech industry, but had given up everything to care for his father. The house, once filled with laughter and stories from Peter's past, now felt heavy with the weight of forgotten memories and silent frustration. Despite his best efforts, Brian couldn't escape the exhaustion of balancing remote work with caregiving. Peter often woke up disoriented, asking about people who were no longer there, wandering outside and forgetting even the most basic tasks. Every day felt like a battle against time, and Brian feared that soon the father he once knew would completely slip away. But just when it seemed like their world was shrinking into endless cycles of confusion and responsibility, a presence appeared on their doorstep, one that would change everything. A shadow in the fading evening light, a pair of intelligent amber eyes watching from the gate, a protector waiting to be found. Zeus had arrived. The sun dipped below the rolling hills of Ashton Hollow, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep indigo. The town, usually still and peaceful at this hour, carried an unusual weight in the air, a silent tension, the kind that comes before something life-changing arrives. In the distance, a lone figure moved through the fading light. Not a man, not a ghost, but a shadow with purpose, a silent protector, lost yet seeking something only he seemed to understand. Zeus, a German shepherd, strong, sleek, and powerful, once trained for precision, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. His coat, though now slightly dusted from the road, still held the unmistakable sheen of a well-bred, well-trained working dog. His amber eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the surroundings with the keen awareness of an animal that had known both command and freedom. But unlike a stray scavenging for food or shelter, Zeus was different. He wasn't running away from something, he was running toward something. For weeks, Zeus had been alone, surviving on instinct, moving from place to place like a soldier on a mission only he could understand. He had once belonged to a world of structure, a world where every command had a purpose, where his duty was clear. But something had changed. It had all started during a storm, a relentless downpour that had shaken the ground and filled the air with the deafening roar of thunder. He had been on a mission, a rescue operation, serving alongside Alice Hayes, his handler, the only human who truly understood him. Their bond had been unbreakable. But in the chaos, something had gone wrong. A flash of lightning, a blaring siren, the sharp scent of fear in the air. Then silence. When Zeus had regained his bearings, Alice was gone, the familiar voices were gone, and the only thing left was emptiness. The storm had washed away his tracks, and suddenly he was without a unit, without a home, without a mission. At first, Zeus had tried to find his way back. His training told him to hold his position, to wait for orders, but no one came. Days passed, and instinct took over. He moved through the outskirts of town, avoiding threats, scanning faces, searching for Alice. But she never appeared. The world he once knew had disappeared, replaced by something unfamiliar, and so Zeus did what any warrior would do. He adapted. He learned to navigate this strange, unstructured life, relying on his heightened senses to survive. He stayed hidden during the day, moving only when necessary. His body was built for endurance, his mind trained to assess threats in an instant. He wasn't just a dog. He was a guardian without a post, a soldier without a battlefield. But as the days bled into weeks, something stirred deep inside him, an instinct that ran deeper than his training. He wasn't just searching for Alice anymore. He was searching for something more. That's what had led him to the outskirts of Ashton Hollow, to the house where an old man sat alone on a porch, his eyes distant, his hands trembling slightly against the worn wood of his chair. Peter. Even from a distance, Zeus could sense it. The vulnerability, the quiet loneliness that clung to the man like a faded uniform. There was something in Peter's scent, in his posture, that stirred something buried deep in Zeus's memory. It was the presence of someone who had once understood purpose, someone who had once given orders with certainty, but now struggled to find his own path. Zeus watched from the shadows, assessing. The man's movements were slow but deliberate. His breathing was steady, but his eyes held a fog that Zeus recognized as hesitation, uncertainty, confusion. Peter had once been strong, Zeus could tell. There was an unspoken weight in the way he carried himself, even in stillness. But there was something missing now. Clarity, direction. Then the door creaked open. A younger man stepped out. Brian. His posture was different, his movements quicker, sharper, but his energy carried something heavy, burden. A responsibility he had not chosen but had accepted nonetheless. Zeus watched them both. He could feel the weight in the air between them, the love, the exhaustion, the frustration. He had seen this before, soldiers standing side by side, bound not just by duty, but by something deeper. And just like that, Zeus knew. He wasn't here by accident. He had found what he was looking for. For the first time in weeks, he stepped out of the shadows and into the fading light. His movements were steady, controlled, not the cautious approach of a lost animal, but the decisive steps of a protector stepping into place. Peter's head lifted first, his cloudy blue eyes landing on Zeus. For a moment there was nothing, no recognition, no words, just silence. Then, slowly, his lips parted, his breath caught in his throat. Brian followed his gaze, stiffening at the sight of the large German shepherd standing just beyond the gate. A stray, number something more. Zeus did not bark, did not lunge forward, did not beg for food or attention. He simply stood there, waiting, assessing, ready. And then, in a moment so brief it could have been missed, Peter's eyes cleared. For the first time in months, a spark of something real flickered across his face. Not confusion, not frustration, recognition, not of Zeus himself, but of something deep inside him, a bond unspoken, a connection forged in instinct, something that Alzheimer's could not take away. Peter inhaled sharply, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. His voice, though raspy, carried something steady, something firm. "He's not lost," he murmured, his gaze never leaving Zeus's. "He's found his post." Brian hesitated, glancing between his father and the dog. He wanted to argue, to question it, but something about the way Zeus stood, something about the rare certainty in Peter's voice, kept him silent. Zeus remained still, waiting for the next command, for the next purpose. Not begging, not pleading, just waiting. And in that moment he knew. His new mission had just begun. The night had settled over Ashton Hollow like a heavy blanket, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. In the distance, the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze were the only sounds breaking the silence. At the edge of town, in the worn but sturdy house where Peter and Brian lived, something had shifted. A presence had arrived, one that neither of them had expected, but would soon come to rely on completely. Zeus. The German shepherd lay by the porch, his eyes flickering in the dim glow of the street lamp. His body, perfectly still but coiled with silent readiness, exuded a sense of calm yet unshakable vigilance. He had not been commanded to stay. He had chosen this place, chosen these people. Inside, Brian sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples, exhaustion weighing down on him like an anchor. Caring for his father while juggling remote work was already a challenge, and now there was Zeus, a massive, highly trained dog with an unknown past and an undeniable presence. He wasn't sure why he had let Zeus stay. Maybe it was because of the way his father had reacted, the rare clarity in Peter's gaze, the quiet certainty in his voice. It was the first time in months that Peter had spoken with such conviction. And so, Brian had relented. One night. Just one night. Yet as Brian glanced out the window, seeing Zeus sitting there, head held high, his amber eyes scanning the surroundings, he felt something unexpected. Relief. For the first time in a long while, Brian didn't feel like he was carrying everything alone. A silent warning. Peter, meanwhile, had dozed off in his chair by the window, his hand resting gently on the wooden armrest. The soft hum of the old ceiling fan filled the room, blending with the distant chirping of crickets. The house was at peace. But Zeus was awake. A shift in the air made his ears twitch. He lifted his head slightly, sniffing, scanning. Something was different. Then a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible, the slightest crunch of gravel outside the fence. Zeus's muscles tensed. His instincts, sharpened by years of training, identified the sound immediately. Someone was there. Slowly, he rose to his feet, moving toward the porch steps without making a sound. His gaze locked on the darkness beyond the yard, his body lowering into a stance of quiet precision. He didn't bark, not yet. A true protector never gave away his position too soon. Inside, Brian had just closed his laptop when he noticed Zeus's rigid posture outside. Something was wrong. He moved toward the front door cautiously, glancing at his father, still asleep. Everything looked normal. But the way Zeus stood, completely still, utterly focused, made Brian's stomach tighten. Then it happened. The unmistakable click of a latch being tested. Brian's breath caught. Someone was trying to get in. The intruder, before Brian could react, Zeus moved, fast, silent, precise. In an instant, he was off the porch, disappearing into the darkness of the yard. Brian rushed to the window, heart pounding, just as a shadow moved by the back door. Then, a sudden scuffle, a sharp gasp of surprise, and a heavy thud. Brian threw open the door, stepping onto the porch just in time to see Zeus pinning a man to the ground. The intruder struggled, eyes wide with panic, his hands held up in surrender as Zeus growled low, warning but controlled. He wasn't attacking, he was controlling. "Whoa, whoa, okay," the man stammered, freezing under Zeus's weight. "Call him off!" Brian took a shaky step forward, trying to process the scene. Zeus had moved with the speed and precision of a trained protector. There was no hesitation, no reckless aggression, only calculated control. "Zeus," Brian called, his voice steady but cautious. "Stand down!" Zeus held the intruder's gaze for a second longer before stepping back, his body still coiled, ready to react. The man scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking. I thought no one was home," he muttered, backing away toward the fence. "Yeah," Brian said coldly. "Guess you thought wrong." The man hesitated for only a moment before turning and sprinting into the darkness. Zeus didn't chase. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Brian exhaled, finally allowing himself to breathe. Zeus had just stopped something that could have ended very differently. When Brian turned back, Peter was awake. He stood by the doorway, gripping his cane, his expression unreadable as he looked between Brian and Zeus. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then softly Peter spoke. He knew. Brian nodded slowly, his gaze falling on Zeus, who now sat by the porch, his tail still, his eyes locked on the night. "He did," Brian admitted. "And I don't think it was just luck." Peter stepped closer, his fingers grazing Zeus's fur, and for the first time in a long time, his hands didn't shake. A new purpose. That night, as Brian locked the doors, he realized something had changed. Zeus wasn't just a stray who had stumbled upon them. He wasn't just a lost dog looking for a home. He was a soldier without a unit, a protector without a post. And now, he had found both. Brian sat down on the porch beside Zeus, running a hand through his thick fur. "You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you?" Brian murmured. Zeus didn't react, didn't seek affection, but his presence was answer enough. Inside, Peter had settled back into his chair, but this time his eyes weren't lost in confusion. They were clear, focused. As the house settled into silence, Zeus lay down at Peter's feet, his watch never ending. He had chosen his mission, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel empty. It felt safe. The sun had barely risen over Ashton Hollow, casting golden streaks across the quiet town. Inside the modest house at the edge of town, the air was thick with an unspoken understanding. Something had changed. Zeus wasn't just a guest anymore. He was family. For the first time in what felt like forever, Peter woke up with clarity. His fingers traced the grain of the wooden armrest of his chair as he watched Zeus lying at his feet, head resting on his paws but ears perked, always listening, always aware. There was something deeply familiar about the dog's presence, something that stirred a part of Peter's mind that Alzheimer's hadn't yet stolen. Brian, standing at the kitchen counter, poured himself a cup of coffee, stealing a glance toward his father. He had seen these rare moments of lucidity before, but today it felt different, stronger. Peter wasn't just present, he was remembering. Brian cleared his throat. "Dad?" Peter didn't answer at first. His gaze remained locked on Zeus, his hand twitching slightly as if reaching for a memory just out of grasp. Then finally he spoke. "This dog," he murmured, his voice steadier than usual. "He's been trained. And not just any training." Brian froze mid-sip. He placed the coffee mug down carefully, his heartbeat quickening. "How do you know that?" Peter slowly turned his head toward his son, his blue eyes clearer than they had been in months. "Because I trained dogs like him once." Fragments of a lost memory. Zeus lifted his head slightly as if listening. Peter exhaled, rubbing his temples as if trying to piece together something fractured in his mind. The words came slowly, like a man waking from a long dream. "Years ago, when I was younger, when I still remembered things, I worked with military dogs." His fingers curled unconsciously, training them, commanding them. Dogs like him. Brian stared at his father, stunned. Peter's past had always been a collection of blurred recollections and fragmented stories, made worse by the slow deterioration of his memory. He had spoken about his time in the military before, but never like this. Never with this kind of certainty. Zeus, as if understanding the weight of the moment, stood up and moved closer to Peter, sitting at attention, waiting. Peter reached out, his hand trembling but deliberate, and ran it gently over Zeus's head. He wasn't just trained to follow orders, he was trained to protect, to make decisions. That's not something a dog forgets. Brian inhaled sharply. It all made sense now, the way Zeus had handled the intruder, his precise movements, his ability to control the situation rather than react with mindless aggression. Zeus wasn't just a stray, he was something more. Later that afternoon, Brian sat in the living room, his laptop open as he scrolled through the post he had made about Zeus. The response had been overwhelming. Hundreds of people had commented praising Zeus for his bravery, but one message stood out. Alice. The moment Brian saw the name, something in his chest tightened. He clicked on the message. "I think that might be my dog." His name was Rocky. He was part of a K-9 unit. He went missing during a rescue mission weeks ago. If he's the same dog, he was never just a pet. He was family. Brian's hands hovered over the keyboard. He glanced at Zeus, who was lying at Peter's feet, then back at the message. His mind raced. Zeus had saved them. He had become part of their home. But was he already someone else's family? Taking a deep breath, he typed back, "Come by tomorrow. Let's see if he remembers you." The choice that wasn't theirs to make. The next morning, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent Zeus's ears twitching. He stood up, alert but calm, watching as the door opened and a woman stepped out. Alice. She was in her late 40s with tired eyes but an undeniable warmth to her presence. She looked at Zeus, her breath catching in her throat. "Rocky?" she called softly, her voice laced with hope. Zeus stood still. He stared at her, ears shifting forward, his body tense. Not in fear, not in aggression, but in something more complicated. Recognition. Brian watched, his stomach twisting. Would Zeus run to her? Would he leave? Alice took a step forward, crouching down, her voice breaking. "It's me, boy, it's Alice." Zeus moved forward slowly. He sniffed the air, taking her in, his tail giving a single hesitant wag. Brian felt his heart sink. This was it. This was where they lost him. But then, Zeus stopped. He turned his head back toward Peter. And in that moment, Brian knew. Zeus hadn't forgotten Alice. But he had made his choice. Alice exhaled, her eyes glistening. She reached out, brushing a hand over Zeus's fur. "You remember me?" she whispered. Zeus let her touch him, but his body remained facing Peter. His posture was clear. He wasn't leaving. Alice blinked back tears and let out a soft chuckle. "Guess you found a new mission, huh?" Peter, silent this whole time, finally spoke. "He's home." Alice swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, I can see that." Brian was stunned. "Are you sure?" "He was yours." Alice smiled sadly. "He was mine. But I think he's yours now." She took a step back. "I just needed to see that he was okay." Brian didn't know what to say. Alice had every right to take Zeus back. But instead, she was walking away. Before she left, she turned back once more. "Take care of him," she said softly. "He's special." Peter ran a hand over Zeus's head, his voice unwavering. "We know." A bond that couldn't be broken. That night, Zeus lay at Peter's feet, his amber eyes reflecting the dim glow of the porch light. Brian sat beside his father, a deep sense of peace settling over him. For so long, he had feared losing his father piece by piece to time, to memory loss, to Alzheimer's. But tonight, Peter was more present than he had been in years. And it was because of Zeus. Not just a dog, not just a protector, but family. Brian reached down, running a hand through Zeus's fur. "You're really staying, huh?" Zeus didn't react. He didn't need to. Because deep down, they already knew the answer. The days after Alice's visit felt different. It wasn't just that Zeus had chosen to stay. It was that they had chosen him too. The house no longer felt like a place of slow decline, where memories faded into the quiet hum of forgotten time. Instead, there was a newfound energy, a presence that made everything feel alive. Peter, despite the unpredictable nature of his illness, seemed more present. His moments of clarity lasted longer, and even when the haze of Alzheimer's clouded his mind, Zeus was there. A steady, unwavering anchor. And Brian, well, for the first time since moving back to Ashton Hollow, he didn't feel so alone. A different kind of therapy. It started subtly. One morning, Brian found his father outside, kneeling in the garden. The air was crisp, the early sunlight painting golden streaks over the damp soil. Peter was running his fingers through the dirt, his old hands moving with surprising confidence. Beside him, Zeus sat, watching intently. Brian hesitated. "Dad?" Peter looked up, squinting as if adjusting to the brightness of the morning. Then he smiled, a real, familiar smile. "Tomatoes," he said simply, patting the ground beside him. "Your mother loved growing them." Brian swallowed, his throat tightening. His mother had passed away years ago, and Peter rarely spoke of her anymore. But now here he was, recalling something real, something solid, something Alzheimer's hadn't completely erased. And Zeus, he had helped bring it out. Brian knelt down beside his father. "You want some help?" Peter chuckled. "Not really, but I'll let you try." Zeus wagged his tail as if approving. A guardian, in more ways than one. As the weeks passed, Peter and Zeus became inseparable. He no longer needed constant supervision. Zeus made sure of that. If Peter wandered too far, Zeus gently nudged him back. If he became disoriented, Zeus led him home. If frustration crept into Peter's voice, the dog simply sat beside him, a silent reassurance that he was never truly lost. Brian watched in awe as his father slowly reclaimed pieces of himself. One afternoon, he heard soft laughter coming from the living room. Curious, he peeked inside and saw Peter sitting on the floor, playing a game of cards with Zeus. Brian leaned against the doorframe, shaking his head. "Dad, I hate to break it to you, but I don't think he knows the rules." Peter glanced up, grinning. "Maybe not, but he's still a better player than you." Brian laughed, a real unguarded laugh, one he hadn't heard from himself in a long time. Zeus thumped his tail, clearly pleased with himself. An unexpected friendship. Brian had always been skeptical about therapy dogs, but Zeus was different. He wasn't just comforting Peter, he was bringing him back to life. But Zeus wasn't just Peter's dog anymore. Somewhere along the way, Brian had started talking to him, too. At first, it was casual, an offhand comment while making coffee, a simple, "Come on, buddy," before heading out for a jog. Then it became more. One evening, after a long, exhausting workday, Brian sat on the back porch rubbing his temples. Zeus trotted over and rested his massive head on Brian's lap. Brian exhaled, running a hand through his fur. "You're something else, you know that?" Zeus didn't move. He just stayed. And for once, Brian let himself lean into the moment. The night that changed everything. As much as Zeus had brought peace to their home, he never let his guard down. One night, Brian was jolted awake by a deep guttural growl. He sat up fast, his pulse spiking. Zeus stood at the bedroom doorway, his entire body tense. Then Brian heard it. A noise outside. He jumped out of bed, his heart racing. Peter. He had to check on Peter. But as he stepped into the hallway, he saw Zeus already there, standing protectively in front of Peter's room. The front porch creaked. Zeus's ears twitched. Brian moved quietly to the window. His stomach twisted when he saw a figure lurking near the fence. Before he could react, Zeus did. In one swift motion, the dog bolted toward the front door. Brian barely had time to follow before Zeus let out a thunderous bark that shook the walls. The shadowed figure froze. Another bark, louder this time. A warning. Then, suddenly, the figure ran. Zeus lunged toward the door, but stopped. He didn't chase. He didn't need to. He had done his job. Brian let out a shaky breath, glancing down at Zeus, who was still standing, poised, ready. He crouched, resting a hand on the dog's head. "Good boy," he murmured. "You're really watching over us, aren't you?" Zeus's tail wagged just once, a silent confirmation. The next morning, Peter sat on the porch, Zeus lying beside him. The sun was warm, the sky a perfect shade of blue. Brian brought out 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for his father. Peter took his with a grateful nod. Then he gestured to Zeus. "He stayed up all night, didn't he?" Brian chuckled. "Yeah, he did." Peter scratched behind Zeus's ears, his eyes soft. He's more than a dog. Brian smiled. Yeah, Dad, he's family. Zeus sighed contentedly, his body finally relaxing. He had spent weeks searching, wandering, surviving, and now he was home. The days in Ashton Hollow stretched into weeks and weeks into months. The once fading house at the edge of town now held a quiet warmth, a rhythm of life that neither Peter nor Brian had thought possible. Zeus had become more than a protector, more than a trained guardian. He was the soul that had reignited a fading flame. The past had tried to steal Peter away, but Zeus had anchored him in the present. The loneliness that had weighed on Brian had slowly lifted, replaced with something he had forgotten he could feel: peace. And the house, once filled with silent echoes, now had laughter, movement, and the steady, comforting presence of a dog who had chosen to stay. The morning that changed everything. One crisp autumn morning, Brian stepped onto the porch, stretching as the cool air filled his lungs. The sun had just begun its ascent, casting golden light across the fields. There, sitting beside Peter, was Zeus, a constant, unwavering figure. Peter held a newspaper, his fingers lightly tracing the edges. It had been years since he'd read one. Brian hesitated, watching as his father's eyes moved slowly over the page. Peter had good days and bad days, but lately, the good days had been more frequent. He finally spoke. "Dad, do you want some coffee?" Peter looked up, blinking as if remembering where he was. Then he smiled. "Yeah, kid, that sounds nice." Brian nodded, turning to head back inside. But before he stepped through the door, Peter spoke again, soft, thoughtful. "You know, I was thinking of fixing up the truck, the old Chevy." Brian stopped in his tracks. The Chevy. The truck that had sat untouched in the garage for years, gathering dust. The one that Peter had worked on before the disease took hold, before his hands had started forgetting the things they once did with ease. Brian turned back slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "You remember the truck?" Peter chuckled, shaking his head. "Not all of it, but I remember how it made me feel. And that's enough, right?" Zeus thumped his tail against the wooden planks of the porch, as if agreeing. Brian swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah, Dad, that's more than enough." A man, a son, a dog, and an old truck. That afternoon, Brian rolled up the garage door, coughing as dust swirled in the light. The Chevy sat there, untouched for so long it felt like a relic from another life. Peter stood beside him, staring at it, his hands twitching at his sides. Brian could tell. He wanted to remember. Then Zeus stepped forward, sniffing at the tires before sitting beside Peter, waiting. And something shifted. Peter exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, running a hand along the rusted hood. Brian watched as his father's expression changed. Not frustration, not fear, but determination. "Let's get to work." And just like that, the garage became alive again. Brian handed Peter tools, guiding him when needed, but letting him lead. His father's hands were slow, hesitant at first, but then, like muscle memory kicking in, they remembered. For hours they worked. Zeus never left their side. He lay on the cool concrete, eyes watching every movement, ears twitching at the clank of metal against metal. And every now and then, Peter would reach down absent-mindedly, scratching behind Zeus's ears, as if grounding himself. The first drive in years' days turned into weeks, and the Chevy slowly began to look like its old self again. Then, one late afternoon, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, the moment arrived. Peter wiped his hands on a rag, stepping back, eyes gleaming. "It's ready?" Brian exchanged a look with him, then nodded. "Want to take it for a spin?" Peter hesitated, then grinned. "Only if Zeus comes with us?" Brian laughed, ruffling the dog's fur. "Well, he's not going to let us leave without him anyway." They piled into the truck, Peter in the driver's seat, Zeus beside him, Brian in the passenger seat. The old engine rumbled to life. Peter's hands gripped the steering wheel, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then, as he pressed the gas, guiding the truck down the familiar roads of Ashton Hollow, he laughed. A real, genuine laugh. The kind Brian hadn't heard in years. And Zeus just stuck his head out the window, ears flapping, eyes bright with excitement, as if he had always belonged here, finding home in the smallest moments. The weeks that followed felt different. Peter was still battling his illness, but now it wasn't the only thing defining him. The mornings were spent in the garden, Zeus lying nearby as Peter watered the tomatoes. The afternoons were filled with the sound of old records playing in the background, the scent of coffee and motor oil mixing in the garage. And in the evenings, Brian, Peter, and Zeus would sit on the porch, watching the sky change color as the town settled into the quiet hum of night. Peter would reach down, running a hand over Zeus's head, and Zeus would look up at him, not as a dog watching his owner, but as a soldier standing by his commander. As family. One day, Brian received a letter. It was from Alice. She wrote about how she had told her daughter about Zeus, about Rocky, and how, though it had been hard, they understood. Some dogs aren't just pets. Some dogs are meant to find the people who need them most. And it's clear now, Zeus was never lost. He was just finding his way home. Brian set the letter down, exhaling slowly. Then he looked over at Zeus, lying beside Peter's chair. The dog lifted his head slightly, sensing Brian's gaze. Brian smiled. "Guess you really were meant to be here, huh?" Zeus didn't move. He didn't need to. They both already knew the answer. Home is not just a place, it's who you share it with. One evening, as the autumn wind carried the scent of leaves through the air, Peter turned to Brian, his eyes soft. "You know, I may not remember everything, but I'll never forget this." Brian swallowed the emotion tightening in his throat. "Me neither, Dad." Peter reached down, scratching behind Zeus's ears. "And him?" Brian grinned. "I think Zeus knew all along." The stars began to appear in the sky, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should be. Zeus stretched out beside them, sighing contentedly. Not a stray, not a lost soldier. The autumn leaves had begun their slow descent, painting Ashton Hollow in shades of gold and crimson. The air carried a crisp coolness, signaling the quiet approach of winter. But inside the little house at the edge of town, there was warmth. A warmth that hadn't been there before. Zeus lay at Peter's feet, his eyes half closed, his body relaxed. He had spent months watching over this family, guiding them back to each other. And now, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long golden rays over the porch, the world felt whole again. Brian sat beside his father, sipping a cup of coffee, a rare moment of peace settling over him. Life hadn't magically become perfect. There were still hard days, moments when Peter struggled to find the right words, when frustration lingered in the air like an unspoken weight. But something had changed. They had found joy in the small moments. And at the center of it all was Zeus. More than just a dog. Zeus had arrived as a mystery, a lost soul searching for something unnamed. He had once belonged to another life, to another world filled with missions and commands. But when he found Peter and Brian, he made a choice. He didn't just protect their home, he mended what had been breaking. He had brought Peter back from the depths of fading memories, offering him a purpose in a world that often felt confusing and unfamiliar. For Brian, Zeus had been a reminder that he wasn't alone. That love wasn't just about sacrifice, but about finding meaning in the choices we make. And for Peter, Zeus had been a tether to the present, a guardian, not just of their home but of his mind, his dignity, his ability to feel whole, even when the past slipped through his fingers like sand. The unspoken bond. One evening, as Brian watched his father scratch behind Zeus's ears, he realized something profound. Zeus was never lost. He had never been searching for a home. He had been searching for them. Because sometimes love isn't about where you start. It's about where you're meant to be. Zeus had been trained to follow orders, to serve a mission. But the greatest mission he had ever completed wasn't one he had been given. It was one he had chosen. Lessons from a guardian. As winter crept closer, Brian reflected on what Zeus had taught them, that love isn't defined by words, but by presence. Zeus never needed to speak, yet his loyalty, his steady companionship, said more than words ever could. That home isn't a place, it's the people who make you feel safe. Zeus had found his family, not by blood, but by bond. And sometimes, that was enough. That even in the hardest moments, there is still light. Peter had once felt like he was fading, like life had become a long, slow goodbye. But Zeus reminded him that every day was still worth living. That true guardianship isn't just about protection, it's about love. Zeus didn't just defend their home. He defended their hearts, their hope, their connection to each other. One night, as they sat together on the porch, Peter turned to Brian and said, "I don't remember everything, but I remember this." Brian swallowed hard, nodding. "That's all that matters, Dad." Peter smiled down at Zeus, his hand resting on the dog's sturdy back. "He was meant to find us," Brian chuckled. "Or maybe we were meant to find him." Zeus, ever watchful, simply sighed, a contented, knowing sound. He had done what he came to do. He had turned a house into a home, turned loneliness into love, and turned fleeting moments into memories that would last forever. Because in the end, he wasn't just a protector, he was family.